My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 32 years old the afternoon my sister looked across our mother's kitchen table and told me the money was gone. All of it. The savings account our mother had been building since before either of us was in school.
Gone.
Mom meant for me to have it, Renata said. You were fine on your own. You always have been. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the window over the sink. I remember the pattern on the table. I remember not saying anything for a long time. I had been raising Renata's 2 children for the better part of 6 years. Not fostering them, not visiting on weekends, raising them. School pickups, doctor appointments, homework at my kitchen table every night. 2 small people who called me Aunt Nora and left their shoes in my hallway and ate breakfast in my house every morning before school. 6 years. While Renata moved, changed jobs, got into a relationship that didn't work out, got into another one. What I hadn't told anyone, what I had kept to myself since the week after my mother's diagnosis, was that my mother had done something extra. Something quiet and separate, drafted by hand and witnessed properly, that existed alongside the main will. A document that nobody at that kitchen table knew to ask about. For months later, in a room full of people, an estate attorney turned a page and read it aloud. I grew up in a household that ran on precision. My mother, Diane Callahan, was a bookkeeper for a regional insurance firm in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The kind of woman who balanced her personal checkbook to the cent and kept every receipt in a labeled accordion file by year. She was not cold. She was warm in the specific way that practical people are warm. She showed up, she followed through, she remembered what you told her and acted on it. When I was sick, she made soup from scratch. When I had a school project, she sat at the table with me until it was done. That was her language. Presence and follow-through. My sister Renata was 4 years older than me, and from the time we were children, the two of us were sorted into categories the way siblings often are, not by anyone's deliberate choice, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments. Renata was vivid. She filled rooms. She had opinions that arrived loudly and friends who called the house constantly, and a social life that our mother navigated around with the careful patience of someone tending something bright and unpredictable. I was the one who sat with our mother on Sunday afternoons and helped her organize the filing cabinet. I was the one who asked how things worked. I was the one who, at 14, balanced the household budget for a month when our mother had a bad back and couldn't sit at the desk for more than 20 minutes at a time. None of this made me better than Renata.
I want to be clear about that.
She had things I didn't. She was funny in a way that made strangers love her immediately. She was generous with her time when she had it to give, and she could walk into a room full of people she didn't know and leave with 3 new friends. We were just different, in the way that siblings who grew up in the same house can be entirely different people. What it meant practically was that when life got complicated, I was the one who stayed and Renata was the one who moved. She moved a lot. After high school, she went to college in Georgia, came back, went to Nashville for a while, came back again. She had 2 children, Lily, who was 6 when the story begins, and Marcus, who was 4, with a man named Derek Poole who left the picture gradually and then completely when Marcus was about 2. I'm not going to catalog Derek's failings because they're not the point. The point is that by the time Lily was starting kindergarten, Renata was managing 2 small children largely on her own, in a financial situation that was genuinely difficult, and our mother was beginning to have health problems that required attention. I was living in Chattanooga at the time, 20 minutes from my mother's house, working as a paralegal at a civil law firm downtown. My apartment was a 2-bedroom. I'd gotten the 2nd bedroom with some vague idea of eventually having a home office. When Renata called me in the spring and said she was struggling, that she needed a few weeks to sort out her living situation, I told her she could bring the kids to me. A few weeks became 6 years. I'm not saying that with bitterness. I want to be careful here, because the truth is more complicated than bitterness. Lily and Marcus became people I loved. Picking them up from school became the part of my day I looked forward to. Watching Lily work through a book above her reading level, watching Marcus figure out how to ride a bike in the parking lot behind my building, those things were real, and they were mine in a way that nothing I'm about to tell you changes. But I also want to be accurate about what 6 years cost. I gave up a promotion at the firm because the hours would have required travel, and I had 2 children in my apartment who needed consistency. I restructured my entire budget to cover 2 additional people, school fees, Medical copays, clothing, food, school supplies multiplied. Renata sent money when she could, which was not always and not reliably, and I covered the rest without making it a confrontation every time because the children were there and they didn't need to hear it. Meanwhile, my mother's health was declining. It started as a cardiac issue, a valve problem that required a procedure in the fall of the year that Lily started second grade. My mother recovered from that, but the recovery was slow, and something shifted in her after it. She was more deliberate. She started sorting through her papers, going through the accordion files, making sure things were organized. She had conversations with me, practical ones, the kind she was fluent in about what was where and what mattered. She did not tell me everything she was doing. That was also like her, to act quietly and trust that the paperwork would explain itself when the time came. Our mother had an estate attorney named Franklin Gear, who had an office in a low brick building on the east side of Chattanooga and had handled her affairs for about 12 years. I had met him once, briefly, at a notary appointment my mother had asked me to drive her to. He was a careful, unhurried man in his 60s who wore the same style of reading glasses I associated with people who read documents for a living and took it seriously. My mother had a will. I knew she had a will. She had told both Renata and me, separately, that her estate would be divided equally between us. The house, the savings, whatever was left after her final expenses. That was the conversation. That was what we both understood. What I didn't know, what I found out only after she passed, was that my mother had gone back to Franklin Gear's office 14 months before her death and asked him to draft an additional document. Not a revision to the will. A codicil, a handwritten amendment, properly witnessed, that addressed something the main will didn't fully account for. She had written it in her own hand, at Franklin's direction, sitting in his office on a Wednesday afternoon. He had witnessed it. His paralegal had witnessed it. It had been filed with his office and noted in the estate record. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She passed on a Saturday in February, at home, which was what she had wanted. I was there. Renata drove up that evening. The following days were what those days always are, arrangements and phone calls, and the particular exhaustion of grief that has practical tasks inside it, so you keep moving because the tasks are there and falling apart is something you schedule for later. I did not know about the codicil yet. I found out the way the rest of this story happens. In a room full of people, when Franklin Gear opened a folder and told us there was something additional to address. But that's the end of this part of the story. Let me tell you the middle first. The conversation at the kitchen table happened about 6 weeks after my mother passed. I had been going through her financial records, partly because it needed doing and partly because I was the one in the family who knew how to do it. I had her bank statements, her insurance documents, her investment records. I was building the estate inventory that Franklin Gear had asked for, the document that would allow probate to proceed. That was when I found the savings account. Or rather, when I found where it had been. My mother had maintained a dedicated savings account at her credit union for as long as I could remember. It was separate from her checking account, separate from the small investment account she'd built through her employer's retirement plan. She called it her set-aside account. Over the years I had seen the statements, not regularly but enough to know the general shape of it. At its peak, when I was in my mid-20s, it had held somewhere around $84,000. The most recent statement showed a balance of $1,240. I sat with that statement for a long time. Then I went through the prior statements, month by month, going backward. The withdrawals had happened over a period of about 4 years, not in one dramatic transaction, but in a series of transfers, most of them in amounts between $3,000 and $8,000, with a few larger ones. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. I recognized the timing, though. The transfers had started about a month after Renata's second relationship ended, and she'd had to move again. They had continued, with some gaps, up until about 8 months before my mother's death.
I did not call Renata that day.
I sat with what I was looking at, went through every statement twice, and then called Franklin Gear's office and left a message asking whether the credit union account would be part of the estate inventory or whether it had been addressed separately. Franklin's paralegal called me back the following day. She was professional and brief. She said the credit union account had been listed in the estate documents, but that Mr. Gear had noted its current balance.
She did not offer more than that.
I called Renata that evening. I said, calmly, that I'd been going through the financial records and that the credit union savings account appeared to have been largely withdrawn over the past 4 years.
I asked if she knew anything about that.
There was a pause. Then Renata said, "Mom, help me out some. You know I was struggling." I said, "I know you were struggling." I didn't know she'd been transferring money from the set-aside account.
She offered, Renata said.
I didn't ask her to. She called me and said she wanted to help. $80,000, Renata. Another pause, shorter this time. It wasn't all at once. And Nora, honestly, you have your income, your career.
You were fine. You've always been fine.
Mom knew that. I've been raising our children for 4 years, I said. And I've been paying you. You've been sending money when you had it. That's not the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more careful. Look, Mom meant for me to have that money. She told me as much. You know, she always worried about me more than she worried about you. That's just the truth. I said okay. I said I needed to finish the estate inventory, and I'd be in touch. I got off the phone. I went to my living room. Lily was at the kitchen table working on a science project, something with paper and string and a cardboard tube. Marcus was asleep already. The apartment smelled like the dinner I'd made. Everything was ordinary. I sat on the couch and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I went and helped Lily with the cardboard tube. The kitchen table conversation happened 3 weeks after that phone call. Renata had driven up to go through some of our mother's personal items, clothes, books, the small pieces of jewelry that needed to be allocated. We were doing that, which was necessary and strange the way sorting a person's belongings always is, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon it shifted into the conversation I'd been waiting for her to finish having. She said again that the money had been given freely. She said our mother had understood what Renata was going through and had wanted to help. She said, "You were fine on your own. You always have been." She said it the way people say things they've decided are true, evenly, without apology, with the slightly elevated chin of someone who has settled something in their own mind. I looked at her. I said, "The will reading is in 3 weeks. Let's get through that, and then we can figure out what makes sense." Renata nodded. She seemed satisfied with that. I think she believed the will reading was a formality, that she understood what it contained, and that my willingness to wait was a form of acceptance. It wasn't. But there was no point in explaining that at a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with my mother's cardigan in my hands. 2 people were present for parts of that conversation who mattered to what comes later. My mother's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Marsh, had come by to drop off a casserole dish she'd borrowed and had stayed for coffee. She was in the kitchen during the first part of the conversation, near enough to hear the general shape of it. And my colleague from the firm, a woman named Priya Shankar, had texted me that afternoon, and I told her broadly what was happening. She would be relevant later, not as a witness to the betrayal, but as a witness to the reveal, because she was the person I'd asked to come with me to the will reading because I had known by that point that I did not want to be alone in that room. Franklin Gear's office building had a conference room on the 2nd floor with a rectangular table, 6 chairs, a window that looked out at a parking structure, and a framed print of a river landscape on the wall that I had studied carefully during the notary appointment I'd attended with my mother years earlier. It was the kind of room designed for necessary conversations conducted with professional distance. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10. I arrived 8 minutes early with Priya, who had taken a half-day from the firm. Priya was a family law paralegal. She knew exactly what a will reading was and wasn't, and she was there in the capacity of someone who would observe and not react, which was what I needed beside me. Renata arrived 2 minutes before the hour, with her partner, a man named Greg, who sat in the chair beside her and folded his hands and looked at the table with the expression of someone who has been asked to witness a thing he's not sure about. Renata had dressed carefully, more carefully than the occasion technically required. She had the slightly settled, expectant posture of someone who knows how a meeting is going to go and has already arranged herself accordingly. She had not saved me a seat. She had arrived and taken the chair that would have been naturally beside her and put her coat on the one adjacent, so that there was a small buffer between herself and the rest of the table. I chose a chair across from her. Priya sat beside me. The arrangement felt, in a way I didn't examine too closely at the time, like the shape of the last 6 years made physical. Renata on one side of something, me on the other. Franklin Gear came in at exactly 10. He was the same careful, unhurried man I'd met before, gray at the temples, reading glasses on, a folder in front of him that was thicker than I expected. He had a paralegal with him, a younger woman named Cora, who sat to one side with a notepad. He offered water. He reviewed the procedural basics, that the purpose of the meeting was to review and formally read the terms of Diane Callahan's last will and testament and any associated documents, that all interested parties were present, that a copy of the will had been provided to both primary beneficiaries in advance of the reading per standard practice. Renata had her copy on the table in front of her. I had mine in my bag. Franklin began to read. The will was straightforward in its architecture. My mother had been a precise woman, and her documents reflected that. The house was to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally. The investment account was to be divided equally. Personal property was itemized. The terms were what Renata and I had both been told they were. Renata's shoulders, which had been slightly raised when she came in, had settled by this point. She had the faint expression of someone watching a familiar movie reach a scene they'd been waiting for, a quiet, private readiness. Franklin finished the main will. He set the page down. He opened the second part of his folder. There is one additional document to address, he said. A handwritten codicil to the will, executed by Diane Callahan 14 months prior to her death, witnessed by myself and my paralegal, and filed with this office at that time. The room was still. Renata's chin came up slightly. Greg shifted in his chair. Priya, beside me, did not move. A codicil, Franklin said, with the evenness of a man who has introduced codicils before and understands their capacity to change the temperature of a room, is a legally binding amendment to a will. Where there is any conflict between the codicil and the original will, the codicil governs. He picked up the document. It was 3 pages, handwritten, with the clear and careful script of a woman who had worked with documents her entire professional life. I'll read the relevant provisions, he said. Renata's hand, which had been resting on the table, went flat against the surface. Franklin Gear read in the measured, deliberate way of someone who understands that the words in a legal document are not decorative, that they exist to do work, and that the work requires that each one be heard. The codicil opened with a recitation of my mother's identity and the date of execution, and a statement of her testamentary capacity. She was of sound mind. She was making this addition freely. She understood its effect. Franklin read all of it. He did not skip the technical language or summarize. He let the document speak at its own pace. The first substantive provision addressed the credit union savings account. My mother had written in her own hand, I am aware that I have made a series of transfers from my credit union savings account number ending 40471, to my daughter Renata Claire Callahan over the period of approximately 4 years preceding the date of this document. I make no judgment about those transfers, which I made freely. However, I wish to make clear that these transfers are not to be treated as advances against Renata's share of my estate. They are separate. My estate, as described in my will, is to be divided as the will states. Renata's face did not change yet. She was listening with the careful stillness of someone who isn't sure what they're hearing. Franklin turned the page. The second substantive provision addressed me. My mother had written, I am also aware that my daughter Nora and Callahan has, for an extended period of time, provided care for Renata's children, my grandchildren Lily and Marcus, at significant personal cost, including financial cost and professional sacrifice. I have not spoken to Nora about this directly because she would have told me it was fine, and I know her well enough to know that is not the same as it being compensated. I wish to address this through the codicil as follows. Franklin read slowly. The window behind him showed the flat gray face of the parking structure. The river landscape on the wall hung where it had always hung. From my investment account, prior to the equal division specified in my will, I direct that a sum equal to the documented caretaking expenses incurred by Nora and Callahan on behalf of Lily and Marcus Poole during the period of her caretaking be calculated by my estate attorney using records I have attached to this document. and that this sum be dispersed to Nora and Callahan as a priority distribution before the remaining estate is divided equally between my daughters.
He paused.
He turned to the attached pages, 2 of them, in my mother's handwriting, dated entries going back 4.5 years. A log. School fees, medical copays, clothing receipts she had somehow obtained, a running estimate of grocery and housing costs she had developed by asking me, in ordinary conversations about ordinary things, questions I had answered without understanding why she was asking. The documented calculation, Franklin said, setting the attachment down, reaches a total of $47,600. He looked up from the document. Renata's hand was no longer flat on the table. Both her hands were in her lap, out of sight. Her face had the quality of something that has been held carefully in a particular arrangement and is now requiring active effort to maintain. Greg, beside her, was very still. Priya, beside me, took a quiet breath. Franklin said, in the same even voice, the investment account at the time of Ms. Callahan's passing held a balance of approximately $138,000. Following the priority distribution to Nora, the remainder, approximately $90,400, would be divided equally per the will's terms. Each daughter's share of the remainder would be approximately $45,200. Combined with the equal division of the house proceeds, which are projected at approximately $195,000 pending sale, this results in adjusted total distributions. He cited the figures, carefully one by one.
He put the document down.
I'll give everyone a moment, he said. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the table and set it down. Cora wrote something in her notepad. The parking structure was still visible through the window. Renata said, in a voice that had lost most of its texture, she wrote that herself. Yes, Franklin said. In this office. I observed her do so. And it's valid. Properly witnessed, properly filed. As I mentioned, in any conflict with the will, the codicil governs. There is no conflict here. The codicil adds provisions not addressed by the main will. Renata looked at me. Something was moving across her face that I didn't try to name. Her eyes were bright in the particular way that has nothing to do with happiness. I looked back at her. I didn't say anything. Franklin asked if there were questions. There were. Greg asked 2 questions that were essentially the same question restated, whether there was any basis to contest the codicil's validity, and Franklin answered them with the same patient, factual tone each time. The answer was no. A codicil executed in the presence of an attorney, properly witnessed, filed with the estate, was not a document that dissolved under pressure. Renata did not ask questions. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at a point on the table between herself and Franklin Gear. After a few minutes, Franklin moved to the housekeeping items. Next steps, the timeline for the house sale, the documentation he would need from me to process the caretaking calculation. He was orderly and clear and entirely without drama. He was an estate attorney doing his job, which was to read what his client had written and make sure it was understood. My mother had known Franklin Gear for 12 years. She had trusted him with the quiet, permanent things she wanted to say. He had said it. Priya and I walked out of the building into the February air and stood on the pavement for a moment without saying anything. Then Priya said, "Your mother kept a 4-year log." "She worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years, I said. Priya nodded slowly, the way people nod when something fits together that they've been holding separately.
"Let's get coffee," she said. We did.
We sat in a diner 3 blocks away for an hour, and I ate eggs and Priya had coffee, and we talked about other things, a case at the firm, a film she'd seen the weekend before. I did not talk about the will reading. I had said what needed to be said, or rather my mother had, and there was nothing left to add. My phone was in my bag during that hour. When I took it out to pay, I saw that Renata had called once while I was in the diner. She had not left a voicemail. She called again that evening. I was making dinner. Pasta, the easy kind, the kind you make when your hands need to do something while your mind is somewhere else. Lily was at the table with the worksheet. Marcus was watching something in the other room. I let the first call go. I finished what I was doing on the stove, served the children, and then I picked up the second call. "I need to talk to you," Renata said. Her voice was different from the kitchen table voice, different from the will reading voice. Something had gone out of it. Okay, I said. The log she kept. The receipts.
Did you know she was doing that? No.
A pause. She never said anything to me either. About the log or the codicil. She didn't say anything to me, I said. About either. Another pause. Nora, I want you to understand that I didn't think, when I took that money, I didn't think it was coming out of Renata. I kept my voice level. I believe that. I know you didn't think it was going to work this way. I don't think you calculated it. She was quiet for a moment. The kids. I know you've been. The kids are fine. They're at dinner right now. I know. I need you to know I'm grateful. I know I haven't said it enough. I looked at Lily across the table, bent over her worksheet, her pencil moving. You don't have to say it right now, I said. We don't have to do this tonight. I just feel. Renata, let the attorneys finish their work. After that, we can figure out what we want to say to each other. She agreed to that. She sounded, by the end of the call, not angry and not exactly grateful, smaller, maybe, in a way that had nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with something having been said that couldn't be unsaid. The weeks that followed had the quality of a house that has been rearranged in the night. Everything approximately where you expect it, but the light falling differently. Franklin Gear sent me the caretaking calculation worksheet. I reviewed it, signed off on it, returned it. I sent him the additional documentation he needed, bank statements from the years I'd been managing the children's expenses, a few receipts I'd kept in a folder, without quite knowing why I was keeping them. The calculation came in at $47,440, slightly below my mother's estimate, because some of my documentation had gaps. I accepted the number. It was accurate enough. Renata did not contest the codicil. I think she understood on some level that she couldn't, but I also think, and I've spent time with this thought, that some part of her recognized what my mother had done and couldn't bring herself to argue against it. My mother had not accused her of anything. She had not called the transfers wrong or called Renata selfish or made any judgment in that document about who her daughters were. She had simply written down what was true and asked for it to be accounted for. There was nothing to fight against there. It was just the record, in my mother's handwriting. The house sold 8 weeks after probate closed. The proceeds were divided per the will. I received my share and the priority distribution, and I put both in a savings account at the same credit union where my mother had kept hers. Evelyn Marsh, the neighbor who had been in the kitchen during part of the conversation, came over one afternoon about a month after all of it was settled to drop off something she'd found while clearing out the adjacent property, a small framed photograph that had apparently blown off my mother's back porch years ago and ended up wedged behind the fence. It was a photo of my mother and me, taken when I was maybe 8, standing in the backyard with our hands in the dirt of what had been a vegetable garden. We were both looking at something off to the side, not at the camera. My mother had one hand on my shoulder. Evelyn handed me the frame, looked at the photo for a moment and said, "She was so proud of you, you know. She just didn't always have the words for it." I thanked her. I put the photograph on my bookshelf. Renata came up to Chattanooga 6 weeks after the estate closed. It was the first time I'd seen her in person since the will reading. She spent an afternoon with Lily and Marcus. It was a Saturday, sunny, and they went to a park, and when she came back to the apartment to drop them off, she stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked around the apartment the way you look at a place when you're seeing it as itself rather than through the frame of whatever you needed from it. She said, "Thank you for all of it." I said, "They're easy to love." She nodded. She left. The door closed, and Lily was asking me something about dinner, and Marcus had already taken his shoes off and left them in the middle of the hallway, and the afternoon went on the way afternoons do. My mother never explained herself at the dinner table. She was not that kind of woman. She showed you what she thought through the things she did, through the documents she filed and the logs she kept, and the appointments she made without announcing them. I've thought, since the will reading, about what it costs to stay quiet when staying quiet is the harder thing. About the difference between being fine and being seen. My mother knew the difference. She had seen it clearly enough to write it down in her own hand and file it with an attorney she'd trusted for 12 years. I think about the phrase Renata used, "You were always fine on your own." And I think about how often the people who hold things together are described that way, as fine, as capable, as not needing. As if steadiness is its own reward and requires no accounting. My mother did the accounting. She had done it in a ledger with dated entries going back 4.5 years, in the handwriting of a woman who understood that love without documentation is just a feeling, and that feelings, unlike filed documents, don't survive a room full of competing memories. She was a bookkeeper. She knew how to make something permanent. That's my story. A handwritten log in my mother's careful script. A folder in an attorney's office that nobody knew to ask about. And a room that went quiet when a man read 3 pages aloud. Here's what I keep thinking about, and I want to hear what you think. My mother knew what Renata had taken, and she knew what I'd given, and she didn't say a word to either of us. She just wrote it down and trusted the document to do what conversation might have broken. Would you have done what she did, kept quiet, and let the paperwork speak? Or would you have said something to one or both of us, while there was still time? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.